Okay, hello. Hello? Hello everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Pushkin House. My name is Andrew Jack. I was the founder of the Pushkin House Russian Book Prize, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here as part of that series of events leading up to next Wednesday, the 28th, which will be our ceremony and the announcement of the winner of the prize for this year, our 10th anniversary. So if any of you haven't yet, we'd love to see you. Do please go and get tickets for that and keep your eyes out for the announcement. This year on the 10th anniversary, we actually had an exceptionally rich and a slightly longer shortlist than normal of 10 books, a great one of which was written by our guest this evening, you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you and good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have you as an audience. And it's a big pleasure to talk about Vladislav's book, Collapse, which in fact we had an induction today at the university, and I'm signing the book to my students. I think, as Andrew mentioned, it is exceptionally timely to the moment that we live in, a moment with fraught with a lot of not only tragic, violent and bad events, but also with a lot of emotions. When I was reading the book, it seemed, we live in the moment, and the book gives a very rich contextual vision of the moments of the ending of the Soviet Union. And today, it seems that the processes leading towards some sort of an end of the Russian political system as we know it today, we are living in it. And hence, reading the events that have happened 35 years ago or so, before the end of the Soviet Union, seem just extremely thought-provoking. So, as an author myself, I understand how much of the personal goes into any book writing. And given this profound intuition that led to both writing and publishing the book at this moment, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, not 5 years ago, but it was being written, I guess, potentially after the Crimea already, or perhaps even earlier or later. But my first question, and I think it's good to start with such question for any authors, is to inquire a little bit into the personal motivations in writing the book. Especially at the stage of the career that Vlad is in, he doesn't need to prove himself to the professional world. And as a historian, you have the privilege of asking questions that are important to you. So obviously, this is a very personally important question that you have asked. So what I wanted to ask, and to begin with, is whether you can give us a sense of the evolution of your own thinking about both, Soviet collapse, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, about the end of the Soviet Union, whether, the results that we will discuss that came out from the book was something that you have lived with, say, 20, 30 years ago, at the moment when, at the end of the Soviet Union, you were in the Soviet Union, and with the beginning of the perestroika, you were, I think, if I know correctly, among the supporters of the perestroika, as millions of other Soviet citizens. You were probably a supporter of Gorbachev, potentially of Yeltsin, right? And so, quite a number of years after, you came to a more dispassionate observation and archival work in terms of looking into what has happened. So is there any evolution of your views from where you were when you were involved as a Soviet citizen to where you came as, I wouldn't say dispassionate observer, because we are never dispassionate, but it is this personal evolution that I would like to ask first, because I think it's important to have the cards open when we talk about, before we talk about the content of the book and about the issues with both Gorbachev, the end of the Soviet Union, but it is about the author. So if you would, if it's possible, Vlad, I wanted to ask this more sort of personal positioning question about the book and how you came to it and whether there was any evolution in your views on that.
Well, Gulnaz, it's always a surprise, when you come to talk about the book and they ask, what about yourself? Who are you? And why you wrote this book? But I understand, the doctor should tell about himself. And let me start, about this timing, this almost improbable timing of the book's appearance. I didn't plan it. I didn't plan on Gorbachev dying. I didn't plan, when all main figures, Kravchuk of Ukraine died, I wrote on Facebook, oh, so strange, just when my book, came out, he died. Then Shushkevich died, another signer of the Belavezha Accords that canceled the Soviet Union in December 1991. I wrote on my Facebook, oh, it's even stranger. Then Burbulis died, who represented Yeltsin at all, trio conferences touring the world. And then Gorbachev. And of course, the biggest surprise was the war. The biggest surprise was the war. And on the evolution of my thinking, let me start that I first began to think about such a book, a possibility of such a book about the demise of the Soviet Union when I came to the United States, to New York to be exact, on August 19th, 1991. And during the refueling stopover in Shannon, Ireland, we all learned that Gorbachev was under house arrest and, power passed to some shady types. And who knows what would happen next. That was a tense moment, but I had to spend a lovely half a year at Amherst College. I did not, because I watched CNN and other news all the time, and this tension and anxiety that probably only this year I relieved the same kind of moment and tension and anxiety as in the fall of 1991. And my good friends over there in Amherst, including pretty well-known biographer of Mikhail Gorbachev, Bill Taubman, who is still my friend, they told me with glee, hey, the Soviet Union is becoming USSR, the union of fewer and fewer republics. And all of a sudden I felt that I cannot share this glee. All of a sudden, I had a cultural burden of living in the Soviet Union for 30 years. So I couldn't participate in this triumphalist moment in Amherst College in the United States of America. And then I realized suddenly that although I marched and participated in all perestroika events and organized my own sort of free discussion club in 1987-88 to fill out the language of the time, blank pages of Soviet history, and we discussed everything from Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to Stalin's other crimes. And despite all this, I wasn't prepared for this demise. It was completely shocking to me. And then I said, something is there. Something is there. And all my colleagues around me, American colleagues, immediately switched from the mode A when they said, but of course the Soviet Union is a post-totalitarian. So I said, yeah, Gorbachev is trying to change it, but it's not succeeding. But it's unimaginable that the Soviet Union would collapse. All of a sudden, in just a few months, they shifted to mode B. But of course it was inevitable. It's natural that such a monstrosity created by iron and blood, Lenin, Stalin, blah, 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 the prison of nations, had to collapse. And that again added some sort of enigma in my view. So I decided to sleep on it. I slept for 25 years. During those years, in reality, I didn't sleep. I met practically all protagonists. I met Gorbachev and his closest entourage. I did not meet Yeltsin, but I met some people around Yeltsin and was lucky to talk to his main strategist, Gennady Burbulis, shortly before his death. 4 hours of fascinating interviews with him. And hundreds of other individuals, and plus archives began to open, and as every historian knows, there are 2 wrong moments to write history. First, before documents appear, and then when too many documents appear. Because you have to read all this stuff, and you know you cannot. It's physically impossible. So if I count how many pages of Mikhail Gorbachev's perorations I read during 5 or 6 years, would be probably more than great Soviet encyclopedia, all the pages of it. So, of course, I evolved during those 25 years when all of a sudden, and it's providential, Gulnaz, it's providential totally, I decided I should start writing this stuff. Yes, it happened after Crimea. No, it was not directly related to the shock of Crimean annexation, but something told me that enough time passed and people begin to move from certainties of the time, triumphalism of the time, forces of goodness prevailed over the forces of darkness, although poor Gorby didn't quite make it, but generally it was a great story, peaceful demise of that empire. And things began to take new kind of outline when people got stuck in their myths and got stuck in their bylines. You would talk to Americans and they said, oh, Reagan destroyed the Soviet Union, what else? You talk to the Soviets, Gorby's treason was the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed. There are little schools and bigger schools. There's a school of those who think that the war in Afghanistan bankrupted the Soviet Union. There's a little school that thinks that Chernobyl disaster ruined the Soviet Union. And they're like groupies, like sectarians. You talk to them, they try to say, no, it was rather more complicated. No, they don't believe you. Particularly with the spread of social networks. I mean, they all believe in their stories. Nevertheless, the final nail was when I realized, and I teach students at the London School of Economics every year, and every year realize that I'm getting older, and they stay young. And they stay further and further from that strange country that I tried to make them understand, the Soviet Union. And particularly when you go through Stalin and reforms and other things, that's a familiar picture. Great, evil, empire, lots of blood, bloodshed, cruelty, great. Students just take it easily. And then you come and tell them, and one day, one happy day, this empire peacefully collapsed without any apparent reasons. And they're baffled. So I realized I didn't have a better story for them. I cannot explain it to them. I said, listen, this reason B, reason C, cause A, cause F, cause, and they don't understand. If this is an evil empire, if this is a post-totalitarian, authoritarian state, run by the implacable party, why all of a sudden it collapsed so miserably? Without a bang. So I decided to write this book. And in the process, when I was writing this book, much of that book was written shortly before the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic. I had nothing else to do, like the rest of us.
Okay, so now moving on to book and the answer to the big questions of what has caused collapse and was collapse inevitable. Vlad gives an answer that, number one, collapse was not inevitable, and that it was driven by the actions of specifically two important individuals. The General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, and then already the president, or before, his political rival, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin. So the book, in a very contextually rich fashion, portrays the ambitions, the ideas, the actions, fears and anxieties, constraints faced by these two individuals. Of course, these are not the only two individuals, but correct me if I am wrong, and this is what I'm taking from the book, there are other actors, obviously, on that scene, on that political landscape, but these are the two main actors. And Vlad, can you share, so it's going to be a complicated question. On the one hand, my perception of how you convey these two important politicians is somewhat negative. So in the end, Gorbachev comes out from the story as, yes, idealistic and ideologically neo-Leninist, but also principled in a way of not using force and violence to preserve the Soviet state. And I think towards the conclusion, you write about haplessness, in a way weakness of Gorbachev, who didn't gather the commitment to preserving the state. And on the other hand, Yeltsin, whose ambition, whose political rivalry with Gorbachev didn't even make it possible for him to think about him as a potential leader of the Soviet Union. I think in one point you write that Yeltsin might have not gone for Commonwealth of Independent States in December meeting in Belarus, but might have led the Soviet Union himself, but that he couldn't even consider because he saw it as Gorbachev's place and he saw himself as a leader of Russia, and he couldn't conceive of the idea that he could become a leader of the Soviet Union. So there is this ambitious, somewhat very competitive and maybe even power-hungry Yeltsin, and rather weak and hapless Gorbachev, which is quite negative if that is what is the сухой остаток, what I take from the remainders, exactly, the remainder of the story, you know, in a very short fashion. So, and this is leader-driven, agency-centered story, right? In your archival research and understanding of the end of the Soviet Union, were there potential other actors that were capable of reforming the Soviet state to make it continue for some time? Like, so there are all these negative actors, but were there some actors, some people on that stage, on the late Soviet stage, that would deserve a bit more praise on your side or not?
Thank you, Gulnaz. You managed to raise not one question, but I stopped counting, actually, how many questions. But let me start with inevitability. I never liked this, inevitability. There's some inevitable things, like death, for all of us. And of course, I accept that general statement that all empires die. But when and how? That's a very different question. The fact that the empires are mortal does not say much about the manner in which the Soviet Union all of a sudden went belly up in such shocking manner within just a few years, when all pillars of the state that all political scientists around the world considered to be totalitarian, yes, undemocratic, but totalitarian. That means something of concrete, of steel, sometimes run by a man of steel, right? all of a sudden that didn't fly, and everything vanished like hot air. So that's on the question of inevitability. So throughout the book, and that made my life much more difficult when I was writing the book. I put the manuscript aside. That is my laptop, nothing else. And began to think, wait a minute, was it so determined and over-determined in reality as we all imagine it now, ex post factum? And I always remembered myself, I always remembered hundreds of other people at the time who could not conceive such things. For instance, just to give you an example, and that leads to the next question about Gorbachev and Yeltsin, two Russians whose quarrel destroyed the Soviet Union, essentially. For instance, Landsbergis. Somebody mentioned today that there's a film by Loznitsa about Landsbergis. And when I wrote the book, I read about the Baltic leaders who, from the start, definitely Landsbergis from the start thought, hey, this guy Gorbachev comes, he doesn't really know what he's doing, but me, Landsbergis, I know very well what I want. And I want independence for Lithuania, period. And you read all this and follow the trajectory of these two men, and Landsbergis, for all his maniacal, determinist approach to Lithuanian independence, he was caught by surprise repeatedly how events were going. All of a sudden, he never could imagine that another Russian, Boris Yeltsin, such a czar-like figure, would support Baltic independence, would sign a treaty of equality between the Russian Federation and Ukraine in November 1990, recognizing territorial integrity of both republics. That was a meaningless document in legalist terms because none of those republics were sovereign, but it played a huge role into the future because the question of Crimea immediately came up, and Yeltsin said, that's internal matter of Ukrainian people. How many Russians were thinking like that at the time? Not the majority, I can assure you. The majority thought quite the opposite about Crimea. So for Landsbergis, all this behavior was, God sent, something from heaven, all these opportunities that he used and other Baltic leaders masterfully used during the time, but they were not given. At some point, a group of Estonia in other Baltic states, comes to talk to President Bush. That's after the national referendum, don't go into details, but the referendum already on the preservation of the Soviet Union, March 1991. And they tell Bush, who's utterly surprised, listen, our best strategy is to support democracy in Moscow because our independence, the road to our Baltic independence lies through Moscow. Only if they themselves destroy their own empire, then we become free. So they realized it very clearly. Then it brings us to the question of relationship between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Long story, many books written about it. There's a wonderful book by Irish journalist O'Clery that is totally devoted to two individuals, Yeltsin and Gorbachev. So my take on it, it's a fatal rift in Russian people themselves between their grievances, the man who holds their grievances, that's Yeltsin, who thought, and many Russians agreed with him, Russians were used as a cannon fodder for the empire, Russians are used as a clay for senseless wars, rings true, and all these things. And those like Gorbachev that embodies idealism, Bolshevik idealism. Another film that some of you may have watched by Vitaly Mansky, Gorbachev Heaven, when Gorbachev says quite openly, I still think that Lenin is my God. Shortly before, 2 years before his death. So both breathtaking, idealistic part of Russian enigmatic soul, and Russian grievances that caused so much trouble to Russia in the past and still is causing today, embodied in two implacable foes. Now, this implacability of their feud is also a very Russian thing. You know, you read Dostoevsky and you realize, hey, they cannot be friends in this nice Lockean compromise fashion. You know, cannot just come back to senses, sit in front of each other, say, listen, let's, you know, our feud is destroying the country, ripping it apart. Let's make a deal. No, it's Locke, it's Jefferson, it's whoever. It's not Dostoevsky, it's not Russia. So there are tiny personal reasons, rumors. When I talked to Gorbachev people, they said, Raisa Maximovna, she just could not go over the fact that Yeltsin spoke so in such a denigrating way about her at some point. You know, it became the knowledge of the town, and so who knows? Gorbachev always listened to his wife. That's a wonderful feature of Gorbachev. So, and Yeltsin periodically tried to step over his ego, and he simply could not. But aside, and the last thing quickly, aside from those personal factors, what was the profound and main reason why Gorbachev's popularity went down in 1990 and Yeltsin's popularity soared was the question of crumbling economy and chaos that Gorbachev's mode of governance created. And only Gorbachev's mode of governance could have created so much chaos so fast.
Before we move to the economy, let me maybe just make a note that your observation about Gorbachev's profound idealism fits well both with Archie Brown's analysis and his take on Gorbachev, and as a leader who, you know, whose adolescent and youth years fell in on the 60s, the time of opening and thaw and sort of this idealism that originates in the 60s. But also, besides Archie Brown's observations, there is another book I was thinking about as I was reading about Neo-Leninism, is Yuri Slezkin's The House of Government, which is a huge, even bigger volume than Vladislav's volume, The House of Government, about Bolsheviks as millenarians, as this sect that believed in certain ideas and that tried to fulfill them. Although Slezkin makes a point that the grandchildren of the Bolsheviks, and if we think about when were they born, I guess they were born maybe in the 50s and 60s, so grandchildren will not capture quite the generation of Gorbachev, but the grandchildren were totally sort of overstepped the ideas of their grandfathers. But this observation about Bolshevism being millenarian, sort of a movement, seems quite fit, although you know, Gorbachev is a later generation than I guess the next generation after. So these are the last fruits of that millenarian type thinking, I guess, neo-Leninist thinking. So then if we look at, you know, again, at this struggle between Gorbachev and Yeltsin, then we have sort of the political populist and to a certain extent sort of power pragmatist who did everything to establish the position, and idealist type thinking, and idealist lost to a pragmatist, I guess. And so you know, from what I've seen in the book, I didn't see any sort of potential alternative of who could have done it better. If there was someone in the circle of Gorbachev, say, or other, you know, Politburo members, you know, whether Ligachev or, I don't know, Yakovlev, I don't know. There are no, I don't see in that scene that you discuss more sort of maybe effective leaders or leaders who knew what they were doing. So that brings me to the ideas on the economic reform. And something I noticed that as I was reading specifically the moments around 88, 89, and 90, after the law on cooperatives, you make very interesting observations about how there was a total misunderstanding and lack of expectation with regards to the relationship in Soviet macroeconomy, the floods that opened between null and bisnull, the cash economy and the non-cash economy. So the liberation of foreign trade and giving more rights to the enterprises, this we're talking about late 88, 89, totally disbalanced the economy because a big chunk of the monetary system was floating in the non-cash sector, and empowering enterprises, allowing them to create cooperatives, allowing them to open foreign trade, sort of removing some of the controls, allowed the state enterprises, the leaders of the state enterprise, the managers, to basically sort of siphon out money, make it more liquid. And we know that it's from the late 80s we have capital flowing out of the Soviet Union into the Western countries. Of course, that increased tremendously in the 90s and 2000s. But the question there that I had was, what do we blame such a lack of understanding of what the effects of these reforms would be? Wasn't there an understanding of how Soviet economy operates and what would happen with this non-cash money, currency flowing into the cash economy? How was your own understanding in terms of, I don't think that we should think about conspiracy, that they knew that what will happen. It was sort of lack of knowledge of how market forces operate, or an overconfidence, lack of education in these things. Like there was a misfit between those who really knew how to work within the administratively command economy, but didn't know how, private entrepreneurship and, the potential for enrichment for individuals, how that could be captured and used for private benefits. Was there not understanding of it? How did you make sense of that gross incompetence in economic policy making in the late 80s?
Well, they killed too many people under Stalin, and lived for too long without the market, and lived too long behind the Iron Curtain. In the 60s, when under Khrushchev, sort of the Iron Curtain began to part slightly, they imported books by Samuelson, by Galbraith, by whatever, Keynes, but that was already the day before yesterday, a kind of literature. So they translated those books into Russian. Some of them struggled to read it in English. I mean, economists of the 60s. And then they had that famous reform of Kosygin, Lieberman, in 1965. But the reform was aborted, crucially, by the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And after that, the leadership decided no more reforms. Reforms are a slippery slope, dangerous, and so on and so forth. The tragedy of this reform, it started pretty well, but no one knew where it would end. So it was aborted. It was stopped. And its lessons were uncritically taken by the youngest crop of the economists at the time that lived through the 70s, lived through the early 80s, and then, I write in my book, at some point, happy hour comes, not with Gorbachev, but with Andropov, the KGB person who came to power after Brezhnev's death, realizes that things are really, really bad. He's known above all as a KGB disciplinarian, but he invited all these smart economists from Academy of Science and tell them, don't be afraid of anything, sit quietly, don't tell anyone, work out something different. And that was the beginning of economic reform, and Gorbachev inherited it. But this stuff is the stuff of the 50s maybe, that was translated and imbibed by Soviet economists in the 60s, then put in a freezer for 15 years, Then they opened the freezer, took out this kind of old stuff, and launched into action. What is so surprising, of course Gorbachev didn't understand a thing. It's clear when it was discussed by the Politburo, Gorbachev was like a cheerleader. Yes, yes, let's go. You know, we'll see, you know. And they saw. And they saw that nothing was working, and all of a sudden workers didn't want to work, that all of a sudden instead of filling shelves, the shelves became more barren, and all these things. And what is stunning about Gorbachev, who of course doesn't understand why it's happening, when some economists begin to explain, he has no clue. I don't think he ever knew about this. This is the most boring part of my book about the two currencies. You know, I thought, hey, my publisher will kill me. Let's write it on 2.5 pages in a very economic language. Nobody will understand it anyway. It took me many conversations with one brilliant Stanford economist of Soviet descent, yes, Mikhail Semyonovich Bernstam, who just basically told me, oh, you won't understand it, but let me tell you. I said, Mikhail Semyonovich, please explain to me again. You know, okay, I'll understand you again and again. And then I understood. Those were two currencies. One currency was cashless, like basically we live today without even having cash in our pocket, and covered 80% of the entire economy, roughly. And the rest was cash for salaries, for, you know, small, you know, businesses, shops, you know, barber shops and stuff, salaries and stuff, 20% of the economy. But it was crucial that this huge mass of cashless money would not become cash one day, because you can imagine the flood, Niagara Falls of money. And that's exactly what Gorbachev and his economists inadvertently did. And I found it so novel and so interesting. First, I was proud I understood it, being non-economist. Secondly, everyone wrote about Chernobyl, Afghanistan, vodka sales that were stopped, and all this bankrupted the Soviet Union. I thought, oh, I found the real reason, the structural reasons, and indeed it was. Because with vodka sales resumed by 1988. Chernobyl cost a lot, but it didn't break the camel's back. Afghanistan, in comparison to today's Putin's war, was peanuts also. So what began to break the camel's back was this absolutely misguided structural reforms with cooperatives and state enterprises being able to punch hole after hole in the partition between the cashless economy and cash economy. And I found it totally fascinating, but it's boring.
No. That's, I think, a very important part of the book that does help us explain the beginnings of, you know, how private initiative worked for private enrichment in the Soviet times. And it is sort of understandable for leaders who were absolutely used to administrative command, doing all the job in organizing everything in life. It was very hard for them to conceive of private initiative and looking for loopholes. And when those loopholes were there, unexpected things happened that Gorbachev himself and other parts of the party nomenclature that lived in a different world indeed could not have even expected. So that is very important part of the book. And to divert a conversation just for a second, but to note of the very interesting Michael Bernstam, that, you know, person you learned the cash and cashless economy from. He is still at Stanford, right?
Yes, he predicted complete collapse of Putin's regime during the first 2 weeks.
Well, you know what else
Western
he predicted?
sanctions, and he was wrong.
But no. But you know what else he predicted? And this is something I had conversations with right at the beginning of war. He came up, I think it was in Radio Free Europe, he said that the West has a nuclear option of freezing the Russian
currency reserves.
Exactly, the central bank reserves outside. And this was very unexpected that this could be done. No one really sort of talked about it in the policy circles.
That's him.
So it came as a very important addition, and in fact, that's what was chosen, and it was done. So he's quite very relevant with very interesting comments still till today. So I didn't know him, but I first noticed him when he talked about the currency reserves in the context of financial sanctions. All right, back to the book. There is another very interesting, there are many interesting moments, so I can only talk about some selective ones. The meeting, when, there are two things about this meeting on 9th of December when Kravchuk, Shushkevich, and Gorbachev meet in Belarus in Vistula. Is it? Viskuli, because I know it as Bilaveshsky or Bilavezha, but in, okay, Viskuli, right? So in Belarus. Yeah. Border in case exactly, quite very close. They could all go to Poland. I did notice it was very close, yeah, to Poland. Anyway, there is very interesting comment you make there, observation about Shahrai's role when these three leaders didn't know, couldn't agree on exactly how to abolish the Soviet Union and yet preserve some sort of community among these Slavic republics. And it was Sergei Shahrai who sort of out of nowhere came up with the idea of the Commonwealth. And so the very unplanned and contingent nature of it that is associated with the group of people who meet there and they don't know yet exactly what they're doing, and then someone brings up an idea, brainstorming, and then that idea becomes a reality. So something that you would think that this CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent State, was potentially thought of before coming to it, but what you learn from the book is that it was right there. They had no idea what they're doing, so it was history in the making. And so reading through this, I think these insights are incredibly interesting to also underpin the, underscore the contingency in the historical evolution. And one of the other moments in this meeting is a very curious moment with the security services, and those who are the Minister of Defense, Shaposhnikov, the KGB, Bakatin, and Primakov, those who swear allegiance to a state, right? And these people, these three individuals, Shaposhnikov, Primakov, and Bakatin, swore allegiance to the Soviet state. And here they were, facing what everyone understood was a coup d'etat. That the parts of these leaders of the part of the state came together and are basically abolishing the state and, declaring some sort of independence or sort of communally together. But there is this, idea of treason in the air, which the participants realize. The leaders themselves also realize it. They don't know what will happen to them. They could be arrested. They could be, accused of treason. The decision makers in that moment are the security apparatus and the Minister of Defense and those who are in the army and KGB. Those leaders are those who are basically deciding. And at that point, Vlad, you show how quite seamlessly these individuals, Shaposhnikov, Bakatin, signal that they support Yeltsin and that they are not going to go against this decision. And so the question there is, what is your understanding based on what you have, all the archival work and on sort of this very careful and elaborate, unraveling of the story? What is your understanding of how did it come to that point that those who have sworn allegiance to the Soviet state so easily were convinced to give up their allegiance to the Soviet state and give their allegiance to the new, in this case, to Yeltsin, to Boris Yeltsin specifically?
Well, it's always the matter of intimate thoughts and beliefs of various individuals, but the individuals you mentioned, of course they were pragmatics, and they lived through all those events, and this is why I wrote such a big book. I could have written a short book to telescope everything into, yes, the Soviet Union was bad, it collapsed, period. but I wanted to show the process, how people change their minds. Even 1 year earlier, the same individuals would have probably not been able to break their oath of allegiance to the Soviet Union. So something happened during the last year of Soviet existence that made them do so seamlessly, as you put it, very right. Some of them believed that the entire Soviet Union, maybe minus the Baltic states, was Russia. And that comes over and over again. So many of them, Primakov was of mixed ethnic origins, was born in Tbilisi and so on and so forth. But others, were Russians. They believed that there's no clear boundary between the Soviet Union and Russia. And the Russian Federation is just a temporary phenomenon because the Bolsheviks carved it out of the body of historic Russia. You don't have to be Putin to believe in this. There are millions of people who believed in this and took it naturally. But what made them act so was the sense that by late November, early December 1991, things went so far, namely political chaos, economic and financial chaos, again, created inadvertently by Gorbachev's reforms, that something had to be done to consolidate power. All those individuals, to different degree, Bakatin was briefly Democrat, he was more democratically leaning, but he ran actually as a centrist next to Yeltsin and other individuals for Russian presidency. They realized that the time for the Soviet Union definitely is gone, that the only thing that can preserve stability in the post-Soviet space is Constitution of Russia, Constitution in a broader sense, not just Constitution as a document, but creation of Russia, because before Russia didn't exist. It was Russian Soviet Socialist Federated Republic, but there was no government, there was no police, no secret police, no army, no nothing, no finances. So they helped Yeltsin at a critical moment during those 2 last months of the Soviet Union to take over what could be taken from the Soviet state. For instance, the question that many people asked Yeltsin, and later asked Burbulis after Yeltsin's death, because Burbulis was very close to Yeltsin at the time. Why didn't you destroy the KGB? Why didn't you just burn down this whole Lubyanka stuff and building and just dissolve this criminal organization? And you go into the evidence, and Yeltsin's ardent desire was to attract the KGB. Attract the KGB to his side. He came to Lubyanka shortly before the coup, basically telling them, I need you guys. I need you guys to construct a future Russia. Because without you, there would be the time of troubles, bloodshed, a complete collapse of discipline. He knew his people, he knew his country, I guess, indeed. And this is why people like Primakov realized Yeltsin is the boss. He's the next czar. It's sort of a little bit, it's very different. Russian history is very different from Chinese. It's a little bit like, the new mandate of heaven is with Yeltsin. Gorbachev blew it, just blew it. We have to follow the mandate of heaven of Yeltsin and help him to build a new state. And this is how it happened.
Maybe my last question, I have many more questions, and we can talk about some interesting details and comparisons that could be made about how, for example, I was thinking about how Gorbachev, you write about his infatuation with history and how he went as he was launching perestroika, how he went into archives himself and reading historical books, and I was thinking, oh my God, Putin has done the same, and what's wrong with the Russian leaders that they become, you know, these historians who try to justify their views, but I can't imagine that, I don't know, let's think about modern Western leaders, that they go into archives and start doing history research, right? Hard to imagine, right? I didn't want to mention by name, but there's these interesting things. But my last question, actually, I wanted to, and we want to have a conversation with you also, thank you for your patience, about the Western leaders. And one sort of yet additional interesting line of the story is Gorbachev's relationships with first Ronald Reagan and then Bush Sr., and a very interesting process that he went through in terms of developing friendships, so how he really evoked trust on the part of Reagan, but then when Reagan was out and Bush came in with his team of advisors and State Department heads, they were very distrustful and skeptical about what's happening in the Soviet Union. It was very hard to come out of that Cold War mentality and to really develop any type of faith that the change in the Soviet Union is real. So there is this interesting evolution of relationships that you described that bring at the end very sort of friendships. Sometimes I think you really, when Yeltsin was really sort of, you know, weakened Gorbachev tremendously and Gorbachev was on the way out, it was Bush who was asking for Gorbachev from Yeltsin and his team that, you know, don't do anything bad to him. Sort of he went as a supporter. So there are very interesting details of such nature. But on the more principled side, beside these personal relationships, you do address the question of NATO and Yeltsin's ambition, desire, openness to join NATO, and this imagination that not only in Gorbachev's mind about the common European home and new thinking, but also in Yeltsin's, which in the book he is shown as also to be nationalist and imperialist, and yet, in a sense, right? And yet a politician who was quite not only open, but desiring Russia entering into NATO. And where, you know, where we see an opportunity at that point, an openness for recreating the whole of the security infrastructure, which one way or another would include Russia. And that didn't happen. That didn't happen. And what is your explanation for this? Is it the skepticism of the West? Is it structural reasons of just the size of the country that is really hard to, you know, to imagine being integrated into European or Western security architecture? What are your thoughts on this bigger issue, which is really will become hopefully at some point pertinent again, because the non-integration of Russia, Russia being out of security structures, arguably, you know, we have the result that we have now, allowed for very quick dismantling of democracy in Russia or any type of democratic institutions, and brought us to this place. So at some point this question might come back if we have the country still standing. So I think that's an important policy question where the lessons of the late 80s and early 90s are certainly need to be considered, learned, thought through, made sense of. And I think the book does add to that conversation.
Okay, I hope it does. The most remarkable thing for me was to recall how we felt at the time. We, by us, I mean more or less, you know, young, elite, intellectual, liberal-minded, all good things guys who sometimes knew, sometimes didn't know our own country because we lived in all this privilege, surrounded by relative privileges in the great city of Moscow. But how quickly, remarkably quickly, those elites that had been, well, the successors of communist state, communist, Bolshevik, communist, Stalinist state that had vilified and opposed the West, and really at some point believed that the West would go up in smoke and capitalism would collapse, and all of a sudden the same people, and those, that they continue to repeat it, as a sort of by inertia until they stopped and all of a sudden said, but where are now your friends? Please give us a Marshall Plan. And it was almost overnight. It was almost overnight. I know there's a phrase, about in other nation, they're either at your throat or at your knees. And it was like pretty much about the Russian elite that happened. Why are you not taking us? Why are you not taking us into NATO? Why are you not giving us all these billions of dollars and Deutschmarks and all that stuff? It was not replicated by similar sudden change on the Western side. Yes, there was Gorbomania, clearly explained by the fact that suddenly a God-sent Gorbachev came and liberated everyone from the fear of sudden nuclear war. It's hard to reconstruct this feeling, but older people may remember it. But the Bush administration consisted of hard-boiled pragmatists. And I actually have great respect for the Bush administration, much more respect than for the Reagan administration, because they operated professionally, they operated collegially. When you read the declassified documents of their discussion, they looked at all sides of things, just not so brilliant individually as remarkable collectively. That would be my ideal Politburo. Those people at first didn't believe that Gorbachev was serious. And for the good reason, because, Bob Gates from the CIA, Brent Scowcroft, and others, they thought that historically Russia always existed as a militarized autocracy. That's how Russia collected those territories. That's how Russia and then the Soviet Union kept those territories. All of a sudden comes this pipe dreamer and tells all these stories about perestroika for my country and the rest of the world, non-violence, no use of force. Hey, are you General Secretary or are you Gandhi? Who are you? So predictably, they didn't believe the guy, and Gates famously wrote that he's trying to deceive us, And then they realized the guy is genuine. Around the summer of 1989, when communist regimes in Eastern Europe began to go falling dominoes. And then they realized the guy is really an idealist. Yes, he doesn't know what he's doing, but that's from the heart. And we should use it. I don't blame them. They're pragmatists. So they began to use Gorbachev as the greatest blessing of history, as the greatest tools of history that the United States of America had ever had in the entire American history. The guy who did for them incredible things, improbable things. The loss of Eastern European Empire, reunification of Germany, the coalition against Saddam Hussein, for free, for nothing, just because of new thinking that Gorbachev proclaimed should rule the world. He deplored the fact that the Americans used force because it was against Gorbachevian principles, but then he had to shut up and put up with this. That was a remarkable partnership. It's very easy to slip into this more cynical explanation that many Russian nationalists would like. Americans pulled the strings. And Gorbachev was a useful fool for them doing what they wanted him to do. It didn't quite look so at the time. It may look so in retrospect. As some people think, when the Bush administration failed Gorbachev, let him down, when he was already riding the crest of the crisis that his policies had created, a perfect storm, I would say. And then he turned to the West, the G7, with a proposal. Give me a lot of money to ensure that in my project of creating a new voluntary union instead of the Soviet Union, creating a new market economy instead of the bankrupted Soviet economy, that would bring peace, sort of Kantian eternal peace to Europe. There will be no longer any divisions of Europe. And looking at this today, it sounds quite attractive today, actually. Except, the crisis went too far. Why Bush and his people said no to this? And they said clear no. First an internal discussion, then they went to London in July 1991 and actively dissuaded every Western European leader, from Mitterrand to Kohl. Kohl already gave a lot of money, but he didn't want to give more. But Mitterrand, Andreotti in Italy, and others, from giving any money to Gorbachev. They were obvious reason. Gorbachev doesn't know what to do with the money. He already wasted a lot of money in the past. That's true. But there were other reasons. Reason number one, I found fascinating, that American society, to a great extent, still considered Gorbachev's Soviet Union as a great Cold War enemy. Yes, Gorbachev was a hero, as an individual, as a leader. But the Soviet Union was, like Russia before, an ominous, autocratic, and dangerous entity, geopolitical and so on and so forth. And Americans were not in a hurry to leave this historical image behind. And secondly, there was a Cold War strategy. All Bush people lived through the Cold War, most of them, the entire Cold War, they lived through it. They saw the collapse of détente, and they thought détente was a misguided affair. They were determined not to repeat it. So what was wonderful, I found in the Bush Library a very frank discussion of what should we do. Should we help Gorbachev with a lot of money? No, because we need a real reform. He's not up to the real reform. And this real reform means full transition to market economy. And with such type of economy, the Soviet Union will not be able to maintain its military-industrial complex and become a third-rate power. And as Nicholas Brady said, who was Secretary of Treasury, this is exactly our goal. It's not surprising. You go back to 1948, 49, the early US doctrines of the Cold War. This is exactly the national goal that the United States set at the time, weakening the Soviet Union to such an extent that it would not be capable of threatening neighbors and other countries. It's nothing new. We heard it recently, this year.
Thank you. Yes, I think Denise is coming maybe to moderate and we can open it up. All right. So yes, we want to open this up and, enough of only me and Vlad responding, but let's hear from you. I think there was first hand here. Okay. Yes, please. Yes. Okay. And maybe what's your name? And
my name is Peter Braga. So thank you very much for your excellent book, and also thank you so much for explaining about your publisher argument, because that was my one criticism of your book, that there wasn't enough of that. So my question is, so in chapter 13, I read it closely, okay? You quote Scowcroft, and so I won't read the quote, but my question is, do you think an imperialist Russia was inevitable after Soviet collapse? Thank you.
We're back to inevitability. Let me make a philosophical statement. I think nothing is inevitable, except death, of course, for individually for all of us, right? Maybe climate change. maybe something else, but not this. Yes, this such thing as path dependency, and this is a very stubborn thing. There's a Russian mentality, it's very stubborn thing, but under different leadership, with different contingencies present, you know, it would have been a different story. We should remind ourselves, for instance, why Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Why all this, you know, brouhaha with perestroika and collapse and so on and so forth? Because Andropov spotted him at some point and grew to like him by chance, by pure chance. So I'm a strong believer in contingency, in chance in life, in private life, in life of nations, you know. But yes, there are structures. I respect structures. But being Russian, I mistrust structures deeply. You know, there are rules set, but you know, Russian psyche is about avoiding rules, for better or worse. So part of me says, yes, you have to respect the fact that for centuries Russia was a military autocracy. Scowcroft was right. But then the same Scowcroft at some point in September 1991, during the big discussion inside the Bush administration, what to do about Ukraine's independence, said something, it would actually be not bad for the United States if Ukraine and the Russian Federation would be part of something common. He didn't specify what. Because without Ukraine, Russia would definitely become an imperialist nation. Because nothing would constrain Russia anymore from becoming Russia. And in some kind of more complex federated structure, there will be other checks and balances on Russian nationalism and Russian imperialism. It's another book that should be written probably about it. But I was struck how at the end of 1991, when you see all the ingredients of Russian-Ukrainian conflict already there, Black Sea Fleet, Crimea, you know, mutual threats, you know, are you gonna nuke us, you know, at some point, Rudskoy, vice president of Yeltsin's sort of running mate, and Afghan veteran threatened to nuke Kiev. I mean, it was a joke, of course, but bad taste, bad taste. And you see how it was, the crisis was at least kicked down the road. Not resolved, but in a sense tactically resolved because Yeltsin was interested so badly in Russia's integration into the West and Western structures. So my simple kind of causal link is as long as Russian rulers, whoever they were, had hope and expectation that one day in the future they would be able to join the club of the West, that meant that they would have behaved differently. When this hope was dashed, gone, weakened by myriads of reasons, Western criticism, Russian stupidity, Russia's war in Chechnya, who else knows what, then the imperialistic nature comes out. If they don't like us, what are we supposed to do? To become a third-rate country, as Nicholas Brady wanted? We shall see.
With regard to the inevitability, I think suffices to say that probably in the 40s, to think about democratic Germany was a very difficult affair, and yet, you know, and this was just a few decades ago. So, I mean, historical terms, not a long ago, but it's. So in that sense, I would actually support the issue of inevitability. You know, when we talk about physical, chemical structures, like, you know, natural world, yes, there are certain inevitable, deterministic relationships, but in the social world, we have to allow for political agency, for leadership, for contingency, for collective agency and things like that. And that's what takes us out of inevitability into the realm of politics is the art of the possible.
What is just a tiny footnote to this? Even at the moment when Yeltsin wanted to join NATO, he wanted, and Mary Soroti, when she comes to lecture, I'm sure she gives you more on this, but I certainly noticed it as well. Yeltsin wanted to be the first and very special entrant into NATO. So Russia is a great country. So that was a kind of almost childlike mixture of grandeur and Russian imperialism with, I don't know, pro-Western liberalism. You know, try to unmix it. It's fascinating.
That rediscovery of Yeltsin and his belief and desire of grandeur and, you know, Russia's being first has actually been lost over the past, you know, 10, 15 years with Putin's media messages that are sent, because the 90s and, you know, the 90s Russia are shown to be very weak and problematic, and so it, you know, the book really brings that point about Yeltsin's ideas being, you know, about Russia's greatness being quite similar to, you know, to the perspective that Putin is trying to impose now. Yeah. And I think like that has been forgotten very much because of the context that has evolved. I think there yeah, you wanted to.
We have a couple of questions online, and the first one is, hello, Professor Zubok, this is George. You mentioned that one of the main reasons for the failure of economic reforms was because they have long forgotten how market economy works. Would you say that China was more successful because it communicates more with neighbors practicing market economy, whilst the USSR didn't have the chance to learn the economic and business knowledge? Because it seems China has undergone the same cashless economy problem as USSR, yet the private enterprises in China and the special economic zones can diffuse the knowledge and adjust the economic policy quicker.
Well, there's a whole literature that tries to answer this question, so I have nothing much to add except to repeat what other knowledgeable people say. Yes, China was phenomenally successful in turning the table, in a sense, because Gorbachev, what he did, he rejected the main political tool he had, the party, and he kept dabbling, toying ad nauseum with the economic model that didn't work. So as Ivan Krastev, one of my favorite commentators, once mentioned, Gorbachev rejected the thing that worked, the party, and got stuck with the thing that didn't work, economy, Soviet economy. Well, it's a paradox. The Chinese did the opposite. They kept the party, quite successfully transferred the party into the you know, elite of the red elite, the elite of red families that owned much of China, even today, and allowed hundreds of millions of destitute peasants to sell their produce. But of course, that means that such an easy way was not available in the Soviet Union when Gorbachev came to power. There was no peasantry, definitely not destitute peasantry eager to work for a bowl of rice. You know, I lived in the Russian countryside. They were not like that. They basically lived like Soviet pensioners on welfare. So it is an open question whether a Chinese authoritarian way could have been used, but the biggest opponent of this was Gorbachev himself. And of course, the most famous episode when Gorbachev made a statement that Chinese way is not our way was during the Tiananmen in May 1989, when he refused to talk to Chinese students because he knew it would ruin the summit with Deng Xiaoping, and he wanted normalization of relations with China above everything, and he succeeded in that. But he returned to Moscow and said, look what is happening in China. We don't want the same to happen in the Red Square. We opt for democracy, for liberalization, for, no force. And he continued to act like that. But without some kind of law and order solution to the problems that his reforms had already created, he had no chance for authoritarian reforms of the kind that Chinese had practiced. He had to step over blood, and he just said, no, it's not me. I simply, not capable of it. It should have been a different person.
If I may add to that, I think it's again the difference between the very sort of high degree pragmatism of Deng Xiaoping, who said, I don't care what color is the cat as long as it catches a mouse, and a very principled and idealistic approach from Gorbachev, who tried to sort of promote and advance his faith in people, in socialism, in energy, openness, and thought that his faith will also be contagious and that everyone, he showed his leadership, but he showed a lot of idealism, while Chinese leadership showed really pragmatism in terms of understanding what drives people on the ground. Sometimes it's hunger and desire to live well. And for Gorbachev, it was the power of ideas. So I think there is that very, again, pragmatism versus idealism.
Then lived through chaos of the great proletarian revolution, of course, the main school for him that convinced him that no. You have to keep control, keep all levers of power, the military especially. And Gorbachev didn't have such schooling.
He took it for granted. It was
He took
given.
everything for granted. He took
given.
the KGB for granted, the loyalty of the military for granted. He took for granted the happy family of nations in the Soviet Union. He was utterly surprised when the Bolts decided, we don't want to live with you. We want independence. He tried to dissuade them. Well, some people even remember when he spoke, said, kind of people shook their heads in disbelief. Does he really believe in this stuff? Yes, he did.
Red stars and hammers and sickles and Great October Revolution, Marx, Engels, Lenin, 1917. Did this founding myth have any gas in it in 1991? Was it still serviceable as a founding myth, assuming the Soviet Union doesn't collapse?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think it had some mileage for very few individuals. To my surprise, this was another surprise of me. It was very hard for me, not that I was very cynical at that time, but I certainly no longer believed in Marxism-Leninism. I had my moment between the age of 18 and 21. Well, I paid my due to, young Leninist, idealist, whatever. We had some Che Guevarists among my friends and when we were students. But then, that was clear it was nonsense. It was a great surprise for me to find from the diary of one of the closest advisors to Gorbachev, Anatoly Chernyaev, very meticulous diary to the day, that Gorbachev even impersonated Lenin in 1989. Yes, he had nothing else to do. You had some actors, an amateur actor. He read Solzhenitsyn, Lenin in Zurich, and he impersonated Lenin alone against everyone, he said admiringly of Lenin. Alone against everyone. I mean, Gorbachev, also, like Lenin, did his perestroika against everyone. Probably unrecognized now, but someday in the future, on historical balances, people, it was like that till his death, I think. Chernyaev himself, a veteran of war, a sign of from aristocratic family. Yes, the revolution abolished aristocracy, but Chernyaev remembered he had the ancestry going back to Tsarist generals and aristocracy. Chernyshov believed in the myth of the revolution. He wrote repeatedly, "This is what makes us a great nation." Even in 1990-91. And at some point he said, with great disappointment, after Yeltsin won the presidential elections, and suddenly in the Kremlin there were two presidents, the Soviet President Gorbachev and the Russian President Yeltsin, you know, two bears in one cage, proverbially. And then Chernyshov writes in his diary, Gorbachev cannot understand. He was afraid that Russian people would crucify him for destroying the empire. Russians don't just care about it. So it was his great disappointment that Russian people did not live up to that historical grandeur based on the revolutionary myth, but also on the imperial myth, in a sense. So it's, but the rest of the people didn't care indeed. When Gorbachev resigned, and I write about it, there's another poignant kind of scene. He talks to CNN cameras, to ABC cameras, and people around the great Soviet Union cannot care less that he's resigning. They're standing in queues to get food. And they just don't care that the state that goes back to the 15th, 16th century, 600 years of uninterrupted sovereignty is going up in smoke at this moment.
Chernyshov is probably dead now, right? But in some ways that his note about how come Russians don't care about it, you know, it's like haunting us now, because this imperial legitimation, the propaganda, very much, you know, is being promoted over, well, since at least 2014, I suppose, right? So in some ways they didn't care then, but the Kremlin is trying to make them care now. We can discuss about the degree to which indeed there is such passion and energy and how well spread that is. But Chernyshov had certain point about it, that there is a big passion potentially ignitable behind these ideas, right? What we see now, at least.
I think we have time for two more questions, and one is coming from the online audience, and then one last question from the... and I've lost it, sorry. It goes slightly beyond the scope of the book, but still might be interesting. Given that Putin's rise to power was essentially dictated by Yeltsin's endorsement of him, as well as Putin's invisibility early in his career, I'm wondering to what extent was Yeltsin forced to hand over the reins to someone who perhaps he knew was a threat to long-term stability, or was he the best there was? To what extent was Yeltsin forced to hand over the reins to someone who perhaps he knew was a threat to long-term stability?
There's a great book written by someone whom I had helped in 1991, Stroop Talbot. I was his assistant to interview Soviet officials at that time. I didn't know at the time he was a close friend of Clinton, strangely enough. But you know, later on, after serving in the Clinton administration, Stroop published a book with the title Russia Hand. And there was this moment, even before the records of conversations became declassified. You can enjoy them on the web, by the way. All these conversations now are open. But at the time, I was revealing when Yeltsin came last time to meet with Boris Yeltsin and asked him, so this guy Putin, is he safe? Is he Democrat? And Yeltsin said, yes, he's a Democrat. And that brings up a question of a great contingency. Hey, Yeltsin tried a number of other individuals before Putin, or very different personalities. And he stopped with Putin because he chose one feature in Putin that he really liked: loyalty. Loyalty. And indeed, Putin is loyal, but in a very perverse way. And this feature of Putin has long been eclipsed by, of course, other features that we don't appreciate very much. But that choice of successor, imagine how different history of the world could have been if at some point somebody whispered into Yeltsin's ears, he's not really loyal, he's not loyal to his wife, for instance. That would have killed his candidacy for Yeltsin, to be sure.
Let's hear, there were 3 hands. Let's hear all 3 questions at once, and then we'll allow Vlad to pick and choose or to decide, and maybe there are synergies in these questions, okay?
People, as we know, often make mistakes and repeat them, and many don't learn from history. I was wondering if you wrote your book to inform and educate your students, or to get it off your chest, or hopefully for people to learn from it and perhaps deal successfully with present issues.
Professor, you have touched upon quite a few criteria, particularly the economic one, the personalities. But what size would you attribute to the Russian people themselves and the latter expressions of their opinion? For example, the first Congress of People's Deputies, Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov, possibly interregional group of deputies, and generally, as far as we can speak, of the organic kind of processes of democratization and expression of that pool of opinion.
So the role of the society and Russian people,
Yes,
right?
indeed.
Yeah, good. Very good question. That was
I will not remember.
No, you will remember. I'll remind you.
Okay.
We have society question. We have what's your motive, what's the ambition for the book, and the last one?
You mentioned that sometime in the late 1991, there was an idea expressed within the US administration that the way to keep Russia from becoming imperialist was to preserve its union with Ukraine. However, as we know, very soon afterwards, as soon as the early 90s, the United States policy has become pretty much the opposite, aimed at disjointing Russia and Ukraine. Why do you think that train of thought had not prevailed?
You mean the
The first, yes.
One more? Unless it's a short question, maybe.
Not just on the follow-up to this, if you can comment upon possible colonial relationship between Ukraine and Russia. There's a bit of confusion because, for example, Kapler doesn't, he excludes this. He says colonialism, in classical terms at least, would be like Central Asia, but not Ukraine. But Ukrainians might have a very different view on this.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you can comment on this. Thank you.
Okay. Why did I write this book? Yes, all the above. I've done it. It exists outside me. I want to forget much of what I've written, but I cannot. So it lives its own life. Yes, some of my students believe I did a great job. Other students complain that it's too big. Why people write books? It's a challenge. It was a challenge. I believe I just jumped, met the challenge. Now I'm looking for a new challenge. It's like, just simple as that. On society, it's a huge question because there's such a remarkable array of fantastic individuals at the time that, frankly, maybe it's my age, became a grumpy professor and all that. I don't see such a constellation nowadays in Russia for various reasons. Yeah, I know many bright, nice people, but those people were truly special. They had charisma, they had life of principles, and people, I remember so clearly how we all followed them. We wanted to follow Sakharov, of course, not all the Russians, not the majority of Russians. For the majority, he had been for years vilified as an agent of the West. But I could see how, for instance, in 1989, and when he died in December 1989, how hundreds of thousands of people suddenly sympathized with him, millions maybe. So people's eyes open. Oh, this is who Sakharov is. This is who other human rights defenders are. The group Memorial that is being reduced to dust now by the Putin government was a spontaneous network created by 2 generations or maybe 3 generations of remarkably principled and idealistic individuals. What happened? The usual tragedy of Russian democracy, when Russian democracy has a chance to thrive, it's usually the period when the state is about to collapse and weakens. And when the state weakens and about to collapse, economy goes down to the dogs. And when economy goes down to the dogs, people demand food on their table and become very angry and follow populists and other people. So Democrats with their long speeches, with their convoluted types of thinking that much of the public does not appreciate or understand, they go by wayside. So, I read carefully the minutes of, these wonderful clubs of liberal Democrats. They gathered in Moscow. They gathered around Yeltsin. The fountains of ideas and proposals, how to write a new constitution, how to do this, how to do that. And then they all were swept away by the huge economic recession of the 90s. Just swept away. And they stood no chance. No chance. What's next? The question about Ukraine. Another huge question. Another question that I can refer to my fellow rival Mary Sorotti in her great book, Not 1 inch, yes, Not 1 inch. She writes a lot about Ukraine. I was finishing the book in 1920 when it was clear there would be something bad between Ukraine and Russia. I didn't expect a war, but I held it in mind as I was writing my book. Yes, I was surprised to find this phrase because, there was another line by Dick Cheney, who said in a very straightforward way, and Wolfowitz and other people in the in the Pentagon said, it's in our interests if Russia is smaller. Smaller. The smaller it is, the better for us. So, which means, cut off as many republics from Russia and so on and so forth. I guess structural reasons, path dependency prevailed, but I think when I looked at it, and my bias is clear, I'm Muscovite. I wasn't born in Kiev, and I'm not Ukrainian, so I'm speaking from that perspective. But when you look with what passion Ukrainian nationalists fought for their independence in 1990, 91, especially in 1991, and how much support they had in Canada and the United States, you kind of begin to realize that to match this passionate energy from the Ukrainian nationalists, and that energy had geopolitically one single purpose, if you ask me. That single purpose was to stay away from Russia as much as possible. So when you look at who opposed this line, American bureaucracy, State Department, all the rest except for the Pentagon, right? And bureaucracy is not passionate. Bureaucracy is just bureaucracy. So the passionate people prevailed over non-passionate people in this case. Nationalism won. Pragmatism lost. Isn't it new? And yes, the last question about colonization. There's my favorite monument to Taras Shevchenko in Washington that was erected by the diaspora, Ukrainian diaspora, and they're poignant phrases about colonization and suffering of great Ukrainian people. Again, my viewpoint is if it was colonization, it was mutual self-colonization and joint suffering under the yoke of the Tsarist regime and the empire. If you consider how many Ukrainians made brilliant careers in that empire. So Ukrainians and Russians, in my view, built the empire together for 300 years. And then this empire crumbled, and then nationalism had a field day. And that's inevitable in a sense. That's inevitable. When there's no empire, there is inevitability that the vacuum is inevitably filled with nationalism and national project. And then nationalism inevitably looks for grievances and speaks of colonization. I'm very tepid about the use of this term as applied to, although, of course, it will be used more and more often, particularly in the context of the wars and who will pay for Ukraine's destruction and suffering.
Thank you, Vladislav and Gulnaz. I wanted to say two things. Firstly, if you want to spend another evening with Vladislav, tonight you have the last chance to purchase your tickets for the Pushkin House Book Prize dinner. So this event is the last in a series presenting the books to the audience, and next week on Wednesday on the 28th of September we'll learn the winner, and basically we are closing sales tonight, tomorrow early morning, so you have the last chance, and we have literally like 2 tickets left. And secondly, you can purchase the books downstairs, both by Vladislav and Mary Sarote that have been mentioned. Unfortunately, we've sold out all the books by Gulnaz, who have a brilliant book published in 2020, published by Oxford University Press, but unfortunately the paperback is now out of stock. I hope there will be a reprint. And finally, we as a Pushkin House, we are still open as a Pushkin House is still open for another half an hour, so if Vladislav and Gulnaz can spend that time with us, and you can buy the books, sign them, and we can still spend some time in the bar and downstairs, and thank you all for coming.